by making a very brief introduction to the panel. And this is, of course, in honor of the Honoris Causa Doctors by the two universities of Madrid, John Dunning and John Cantwell. And it's interesting that we have here also the one who invited John Dunning and made laudatio in John Dunning's Honoris Causa Doctorate. So you may see here the images of the two ceremonies, and look as they were nice, both John Dunning and John Cantwell getting the hat, and I turn now to the panelists. We have in person 4 panelists here. Juan Duran, who is still as nice as he is in that picture. Then John Cantwell, then Christine Brandl, and we'll have Brigitte Grogard online. Unfortunately, we don't have with us Klaus Macharzina, whom I have invited, but his chair is there. So this session is a tribute of the EIBA community to the two Johns, as I like to say. And these Johns are very often together. They are very often in many EIBA conferences. I have here pictures of just 3 conferences in Reading in '92, in Lisbon '93, and in Catania, which was the last EIBA conference attended by John Dunning. So I wondered what they might have been. We know that they have been, in one case, and still is, outstanding scholars. But what might they have been if they were not scholars, if they had followed a different approach? I think that John Dunning might have been a Royal Navy admiral after his long time, about 3 years in the Royal Navy. Here is his post in Ceylon, where he has been during the war, and here is his last Her Majesty's ship, the Condor. With regard to John Cantwell, what do you think? What might John Cantwell have been? Would he not be an outstanding scholar, as we know? And I think, it's my feeling, that he might have been an outstanding marketeer of traditional foods and crafts. Look, his advertising of Belgian cheese, and also of Jerez wine, and even handicrafts like Dutch clothes. So I think we lost a very reliable and good marketeer, but of course we have a much better scholars. Thanks, John. So they have been two committed and enthusiastic EIBA supporters. The first ISEG conference of John Dunning was in Uppsala, 97. And you may see here on the first row, John Dunning and Lars Gunnar Madsen, many years ago. And the first ISEG conference of John Cantwell has been in Fontainebleau in 1982, as he reminded in the ceremony of the Honoris Causa Doctorate. And there they have presented a joint paper, which has been the first publication, as far as I know, of John Cantwell, about inward direct investment from the United States and Europe's technological competitiveness. Technology and competitiveness are everywhere along these lines in John Cantwell's perspective. There are a lot of commonalities in their involvement with ISEG. They have been both attached to ISEG since the early years, since the very beginning of ISEG. They have played a magnet role in attracting young, promising researchers to ISEG. Of course, first of all, their own PhD students, but also other young scholars. They have served in multiple doctoral tutorials. Both were among the ISEG fellows for founding fathers in 2001, together with Hale and with Vitor. And both served as deans of the ISEG fellow. But there are some differences between them. John Cantwell served as ISEG president and organized a memorable ISEG conference, Reading, in 1992. John Dunning, not. John Dunning has received so far the only ISEG Lifetime Achievement Award in Ljubljana 2004, and I think it's time for the ISEG board to think about granting this award to other people inside our community. John Dunning had a crystal ball, as you see there in two pictures, anticipating IB development up to 2027. There, he might have even imagined that we will be under a pandemic now, I don't know. And fourth, John Cantwell is still serving as ISEG editor. And another important difference is that John Cantwell has been much more successful at attracting young ladies, as you may see in this picture, where he's together with very nice colleagues, and some of them former PhD students of him. If we think in a more focused and professional way, I think that the interaction between these two men can be seen from a co-evolutionary perspective. John Dunning has been supervisor of John Cantwell. John Cantwell's first published article was, as I have shown before, co-authored with John Dunning. John Dunning has, as far as I can see, played a relevant influence in shaping John Cantwell's early thinking and career. But there is the other side. It is true, in my view, that John Cantwell has also influenced John Dunning's thinking, namely in three perspectives. The evolutionary approach that originally John Dunning had not into account. Second, the relevance of technological change, a much more in-depth perspective of technological change. And third, the interaction between multinational enterprises and host country innovatory environments. And this co-evolutionary process led to CANTWELL Dunning and Lundin 2010, which is a reference in IB studies now. So EIBA has a very significant depth to both John Dunning and John CANTWELL. That is why we are here, and I'm very glad to have shared my thoughts with you, and I'm sure that you learn a lot from this session. Many thanks for your attention. Thank you very much. And now I'll move to the panelists, and first will be my good friend, Juan Duran. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, and thank you for have chosen this session, which means you have a good taste. And well, I will try to be brief and to make some comments complementary to what Vitor's presentation. And somehow I underline in this presentation how EIBA has a lot of depth, like Vitor said, to John Dunning and John CANTWELL. And as I put in this slide, from Reading, both of them, up to in the academic world, be leaders in the academic world. And in this audience, it's difficult to say things new about both John CANTWELL and John Dunning. Also, we all have somehow insights that we have learned from their publication and from listening to them. I will make a few comments about John Dunning first, then John CANTWELL, then I will come back to John Dunning to end up. Well, John Dunning, I think, is widely recognized as the father of field of international business. He spent more than only 50 years researching in the economics of international investment and multinational enterprises. We know and we have learned a lot from the eclectic paradigm as an envelope and as a framework to analyze international business, to analyze and understand not only multinational firms, but also to understand how the international economics work. Professor Dunning has honorary doctorate from several universities, one my own university, Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, also Uppsala, Sweden, Antwerp, Chinese Cultural University, Lund in Sweden, and Beijing. And as I think Vitor mentioned, we, EIBA, present a Lifetime Achievement Award in Ljubljana, Slovenia. Also, the EIB Executive Board award gold medal to Professor John Dunning at the 50th celebration of JITS. John Dunning, well, he's from Reading, I say a school of thought in international business, and the Center of International Business has the name of John Dunning. John Dunning was the first dean of the EIBA Fellows. Now I will make a few remarks about John CANTWELL. especially reading his main areas of research. He has a lot of publications. In the main contribution themes are technological innovation in multinational companies, role of multinationals as coordinators of IB networks, coevolution of multinational institutional change, interaction between foreign-owned subsidiaries and local firms, and the historical trend towards multi-technology firms. As also Vitor mentioned, John Dunning was the supervisor, and in my opinion, some kind of a guide for John Cantwell in the IB School of Readiness, I name it. Also has experience in academic, in governance and institutions, especially he was EIBA president in '92. He has experience in editorship, special editor of JIBS. He has an important role in the development of international research networks. Also, Vitor mentioned the PhD students that John Cantwell supervises. He has been the Dean of EIBA Fellows too, from 15 to 80. Now I will dedicate a few minutes to John Dunning Honoris Causa. Well, for one reason, he was in my own university, and I was the one that promoted John Dunning to become Doctor Honoris Causa in the Autonomous University of Madrid. Was in the 90s, we organized the EIBA conference in Madrid under this lemma, changes in international business environment. From there are always changes. I think it was a good title, I suppose. This is the program. It was a protocol publication for the Doctor Honoris Causa celebration. And this is both of us, John Dunning and myself. We walk like you did a couple of days ago with Isabel to start the ceremony of Doctor Honoris Causa. Here is my laudatio of John Dunning, the presentation also, and this is John Dunning lecture. This is I will make a few also comments about the lecture of John Dunning in the Doctor Honoris Causa ceremony. He underlined, he talked about the changes in the configuration of government marketing hierarchies in the triad from the mid-19th to mid-20th century, from mid-20th century to mid-80s, and the current, at that time, 90, and the like future situation. He was not only, like Vitor said, in the 80s, but in my opinion, in the 90s, John Dunning tried to forecast somehow and to figure out how the future could be combining in the triad, combining government marketing hierarchies, and also he introduced another thing, probably thinking on John Cantwell, technology. And he, in this picture, in this figure, he tried what he tried. He shows how the ponderation, the weights of these three variables in the period that I mentioned. And then after, he also said that the triad should include technology. And he was quite right. Future situation, I want to say that in the 90s, I think the Berlin Wall fall in the 89, and a few years after 90, the Soviet Union collapsed. And this changed a little bit the environment. So we didn't know that the Soviet Union was collapsed when we, in the 90s, in Madrid, say changes in the environment. Well, the situation how John Dunning foresaw was the relevance of democratization and economic interdependence, more open economies. We all know about it, but it was in the 90s, Soviet Union, China, and India. Expansion of multinationals, we know about that. You look at the programs of the EIBA conferences, and you see how things have been changing, emerging, and with a lot of denomination and topics to research. Also, the government repercussion on the competitive of markets and hierarchies, increasing interdependence among them, which is really true. Has been increasing since 90, John Dunning saw. A systemic and holistic approach to the triad economic organization, that's the way it should be. And a book that I like very much is the one, Making Globalization Good, which to me, looking to the book, I listened to John Dunning talking about this book and we interchange opinion about that. But to me, it's a clue is an idea of the sensitivity and the capability of John Dunning to see the future, you know, to see the problems, not only of the bad and good globalization goods, let's say, but this is the picture of the deans and doctors from the University Autónoma with the rector in the middle when we finish the ceremony. And this is the last picture I'm going to show, where is Christine is the John Dunning's wife, and only one thing is that the academic dress of John Dunning, I have it in my house because Christine sent it to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juan. Now we'll move to John Campbell. Moving. Muy emocionante.
Sí.
Well, thank you very much for your remarks, both Vitor and Juan, which I think are both very much on point. I perhaps have to begin by saying that to almost repeat myself from the Honoris Causa ceremony the other day, by saying that I think this is also, for me, a great honor to be here today, to be recognized in this way, featured on this panel. The Honoris Causa Doctorate, of course, was for the university more widely, but this has also a special meaning for me because of my role in EIBA over very many years, and I think also because of the connection with John Dunning. I knew John Dunning for very many years, and so this could be a very lengthy story or presentation. It clearly won't be. But it's a story that in some ways, for me, begins with me as a very nervous young man sitting in John Dunning's office with him behind his desk when I was being interviewed along with other candidates for a research student position for which he had funding at the University of Reading. And it ends with us almost in the polar opposite positions, with him visiting Rutgers University after I'd taken the position that he once had as Professor of International Business there, in my office with me behind the desk and him in a chair further back in the office. But in each of these cases, there was a certain affinity between us, I think. There was a commonality of thought that was evident from the first to the last. So I'd like to speak, therefore, principally about some selected highlights of John's role as a mentor to me, an influencer, but not just of me, but of others in the wider profession, which were very considerable. So as a new PhD student, as I said, the early meetings, I wasn't really in the international business field at all. So to first tell you an honest truth, at that time, I was thinking of doing a dissertation that would be more based on the history of economic thought. I was trained as an economist, but there wasn't the funding to do that at either the universities of Oxford or London, where I'd been previously. And John Dunning had a fund for a studentship, so I went along as I've just explained. And the first meeting that I had with him, by which I don't mean the interview, but the subsequent meeting, once I'd been selected, as it were, and I showed up, it was a first meeting that would never happen these days. In fact, in many ways, you might say it was pretty outrageous from today's perspective, maybe even a little bit back then, but it was an approach that perfectly suited me. So just to explain, at our first meeting, and because it had been in my days as an undergraduate in Oxford, John Dunning would give me a reading list, gave me a reading list, suggested one or two things that I could particularly look at. I remember in particular Heimer's dissertation that he wanted me to read, which he was quite proud that he brought to Reading, because at that time it hadn't been published. It was available though in a manuscript form. So he encouraged me to read that in particular. And the form of the meeting was, well, you know, read around a bit, think about what you might like to do, because of course I was a blank slate at the time. I had no kind of preconceptions as to the subject of my dissertation. Read around a bit, come back in 3 months' time and we'll have another chat. That was the kind of approach that would not go down well these days with all the sort of methods training, you know, careful coursework and so on. Of course, I should say in the British system, I'd already done a master's course in economics, which actually turned out to be a bit of a problem subsequently, because although John had funding for 3 years for a research student, because I'd already had 1 year as a master's student under an Economic and Social Science Research Council grant, I only had a further 2 years to run. So I only got 2 of the 3 years of funding. And, you know, luckily I was bailed out by John, which is the third bullet point here. But I was going to mention first that during those early years, John Dunning was on sabbatical leave for a couple of years, actually, in Canada. And he was away especially for about a year. And so it was really me reading around, formulating some ideas, putting some things down on paper, but not sufficient, as it were, to contribute to an original contribution to the field at that point. But as I said, it stood me in very good stead because I got a great grounding in the subject in the way that I think many people don't today. They just read the latest journal articles and they're not familiar perhaps with all the history of the subject area, which I was, because I had read very carefully all the background and origins of the field, including John's own work. Also, it was a great time because even if Dunning himself wasn't around all that much in the first couple of years, there were many research visitors in Reading. And those research visitors, particularly in his absence, wanted to engage with me. So this was really a kind of great opportunity, because I should explain for those who don't know, at the time, John Dunning was, you know, Mr. Eminent Greece in the profession. He was the one great scholar in the international business field, particularly in Britain, but internationally too. So many research visitors were coming from all over the world to both meet him and to engage with the Reading community. And of course, as his kind of trusted associate, particularly after a certain point, I got to meet many of these, take them out socially and so on. And this was, so for example, I took Danny van den Balk, who was a long-time EIBA associate. I remember we went to the cinema in Reading, you know, this sort of thing. So we had a lot of socialization that was very good. And as I've mentioned, despite running out of funding, John Dunning then essentially gave me a research assistant position, in which capacity I became pretty highly productive. It meant that it was a little bit longer to complete the PhD because I had requirements for the projects we were working on for both the OECD and the Institute for Research on Multinationals, IRM. But both of those, in a way, were relevant to the research I was doing, and they helped to integrate me in the IB field. And that ultimately led, of course, to the book based on my dissertation that Juan mentioned earlier on, Innovation and MNCs. Even when he was away, as I've already described, I learned a great deal from John Dunning. Indeed, I suppose in the early days, I learned most of all just by reading his work. There weren't so many interpersonal contacts at that time because there was a degree of distance between an early student and a professor. But I learned a lot even before those interpersonal relationships were well established simply by reading his work. And what I found, which of course was then reflected in the fact that we became quite close and friends, is that many of the conceptual insights that could be discovered in his work were relevant to what I wanted to do and to my own thinking. So in other words, we were always essentially, I think, on the same page. I could contrast this, for example, with people like Mark Casson or Peter Buckley, also known as being affiliated with the Reading School and around at the time. But, you know, there was a certain degree of friction, especially at a personal level between Mark and John. John Dunning and I saw much more eye to eye. And consequently, I think, you know, there was a little bit of a sort of distance between Mark Casson and myself in the early days too, for just the same reasons, because I was identified with John Dunning. Another person who had a great influence on me was Keith Pavitt, who I met at the earliest EIBA conference in Fontainebleau in 1982. And between them, as it were, those are the two sides: international business with John Dunning, technological innovation with Keith Pavitt. So these had a great influence on the research path I then took. So to give an illustration, in some of my earlier work, which was then reflected in that first book of 1989, a number of people saw in that they would take that in part as a critique of the sort of what they perceived to be the Dunning paradigm, saying, well, you're arguing, aren't you, that, you know, to put things in eclectic paradigm terms, that firms acquire ownership advantages by going abroad. Doesn't Dunning argue, on the contrary, that, you know, firms must have ownership advantages prior to the act of internationalization? Well, neither Dunning nor I really saw this as a conflict or a disagreement or a problem. On the contrary, we saw an interaction, a dynamic interaction between these two elements in the development of ownership advantage. And so where others had seen static dualisms, as I mentioned indirectly in another comment in the Honoris Causa ceremony, we saw a co-evolutionary interaction of different processes. Then in terms of the organizations such as EIBA, I served as president, as you've mentioned already, Vitor, in 1982 when I organized the conference in Reading. But really, again, that was attributable to John's influence, not just with me, but with others like Danny van den Balk and Neil Hood, who essentially took me onto the EIBA board, even when I was a very young, naive, still a student, actually, when I joined the EIBA board. So it was clear that, you know, John Dunning's encouragement and support was vital as a stepping stone to my later career. Now, a couple of illustrations of how I built, as Vitor rightly observed, on John Dunning's conceptual insights, which I mentioned earlier in some of my own earlier contributions. Earlier research on American investment in Europe, of which John had, I think, 3 books that were very important, had used the technology gap approach or a product cycle framework. Of course, Vernon and Hirsch did this, which was consistent in policy terms with the so-called American challenge, as it was put by, just recall that I think, remove the mask as I did at the Complutense ceremony midway through as well. So Servan Schreiber and the Défi Américain had essentially been very influential at the time in the 60s and early 70s, just prior to the time I came into the field, and essentially suggested that American firms would have a big advantage when they came to Europe. Dunning, however, suggested that there might be the possibility of local benefits to indigenous firms in the UK and elsewhere in Europe through what he termed a technological multiplier. He was obviously using the kind of analogy with Keynesian economics in which you can get a multiplier effect, in which an initial demand shock can lead to subsequent rises in demand. And so Dunning had translated this in terms of the possibility of technology transfer taking off subsequent on an inward investment. And I translated that into the possibility of what I called a virtuous cycle reasoning in terms of patterns of cumulative causation. In other words, you could get a virtuous cycle or a vicious cycle. And what I did in my work, like in the book, which we alluded to earlier, is to show the conditions under which we would be likely to get a virtuous as opposed to a vicious cycle. Namely, where there were established technological traditions in an industry and in a group of firms, like, for example, in the German chemical industry, there would be likely to be a competitive stimulus as a consequence of the arrival of American firms with the most modern, up-to-date techniques, management methods, and so on. Where European firms had a technological tradition on which they could draw, they would be best able to respond. And this was what indeed the evidence suggested. Both Dunning and I also, I think, found affinity between the eclectic paradigm and evolutionary or historically grounded approaches. So Dunning made some of the major contributions, I think, to the history of international business. I was certainly very influenced by his 1983 paper looking at historical patterns, still use that actually these days with my own students in teaching, in which he looked at historical patterns of both inward and outward investment and the growth path of international business. And we understood that this could be explained in large part through the reference to O, L, and I, the eclectic paradigm factors, explaining those in evolutionary path-dependent terms as evolving gradually historically over time. We both also insisted, as I think both Vitor and Juan have mentioned, that IB should be seen in a systemic or holistic framing, which at the time was becoming actually less fashionable as people were increasingly shifting over to a very focused theory of the firm, such as Buckley and Casson or Jean-Francois Henart. So as IB theory was often collapsing into a theory of the multinational enterprise per se, and its business strategy, reflected, for example, in the work of people like Rugman and Verbeke, we were always much more aware of the general framing within which international business systems were operating. And I think the eclectic paradigm very much identifies those factors. We both also favored, and this is very much in tune with the eclectic paradigm, a theoretical and methodological pluralism and intellectual synthesis. John Dunning was perhaps one of the greatest synthesizers in this respect, bringing together different intellectual traditions and reconciling them where appropriate to forge new conceptual ideas. Now, I mean, I could hardly, as I say earlier, reference all the debts that I would have to John Dunning, and anyway, such debts are never completely repaid. They can only partially be repaid by one's students. And by the way, actually, those attractive young ladies you were showing in the photo were all former students of mine in the picture. So one can follow in one's mentor's footsteps, as I think I have done. One can extend their intellectual contribution and so on, but this is really the only reward that a student can give a former professor. Some of the debts that I owe to John Dunning, without whom really I wouldn't have had a career as I have, you know, we started out with Dunning and Cantwell papers, which looking back actually was already a kind of sort of indirect recognition on John Dunning's part and my contribution, in the sense that not every PhD student got to write papers with him, but you know, it was Dunning and Cantwell, and they were became quite well-known papers, later becoming Cantwell and Dunning. So this, I think, got me kind of into the scene because everybody knew John, and if I was his co-author, I couldn't be entirely bad, and therefore, you know, I gained a degree of recognition from the very beginning. Opportunities for presentation at high-level conferences. Well, I've mentioned already, when I was first hired as an RA, essentially it was on an OECD project. It was on new forms of international investment, although John and I always insisted it should have been new forms of international involvement rather than investment, because the whole point was it would be things like subcontracting, franchising, and so on. But anyway, this big OECD project, and I remember arriving actually at this OECD conference. And, you know, I think I was really there on behalf of John Dunning, I suspect. But anyway, there were all these sort of well-known names in the field, and there was a nice round table, and each of them has a big label, you know, professor this, professor that. All of them were household names, and I recognized them. And there was mine, Professor Cantwell. And I thought, well, how do I tell them I'm not yet a professor? I'm just a student, you know. But because I was identified with John, that is how I was seen. And that, of course, you know, there's no price on something like that, right? I mean, it immediately gets you into the field talking to people. It's a sign of recognition. Likewise with the UN, John was the primary advisor, the chief economic advisor to the UNCTAD section, the UN section on transnational corporations. So again, I was often advising them really because, you know, he was encouraging it. Or, you know, the reaction I remember of David Aldrich, who's more in the innovation field. And the first time I met him, and I think he said to me, and again, I was only a young person. I think I wasn't a student at the time, but a young professor. And he said to me, I thought you were much older. I said, well, why did you think that? He said, well, you know, Dunning and Cantwell, Cantwell and Dunning, I thought that, you know, you were about the same age. It never occurred to him that, you know, not necessarily the supposition one would automatically make when you see co-authors, you might have supposed. But anyway, that was what he had concluded. Now, the other thing that I perhaps should mention is John Dunning had pioneered the greenback series. Greenbacks, of course, also means the US dollar. But in those days, we met a University of Reading discussion paper series. And I should say that back in those days, we didn't have electronic online publications. We didn't have, you know, circulation through electronic media. Everything was in paper. And at the time, also, journals weren't quite so influential as they are today. You know, today there's nothing for a young person that would beat a Gibbs publication. But back then, it was a book, right? So I did a book. Other people, the best known features of one's work were really in books rather than in journal articles. But the Greenback series, because John had pioneered it, and because there were so many of these research visitors who came to Reading who were already well known in the field, and who were therefore kind of also household names. And John Dunning's price was always, you must give us a paper for the Greenback. You're going to present this at a department seminar in Reading, but then it's going to go into the Greenback series. So the fact that I was able to get my work out in this Greenback series, which was circulated to all the main scholars in the field at the time, meant that there was also a high degree of recognition just by virtue of publishing in that series. Now, from an EIBA perspective, Dunning was always a great believer in EIBA. That was deeply ingrained. And I think it was reinforced by this Honoris Causa ceremony in the Autonomous University that Juan was describing. My impression, I may be wrong, is that that ceremony was slightly less formal than the Complutense ceremony. I think that may be because Complutense goes back to, you know, 1290 or whatever it was. The Autonomous University is somewhat more recent. I'll ask Juan about that later because he would clearly have a better view of that than I do. But it was very nice that Juan was able to describe that in more detail to us. Dunning and I both saw EIBA as part of a kind of global association of international business academies, not as Tunga Kayak has several times insisted to me, oh, EIBA, that's a different organization. It's rival to the AIB, which is very damaging in my view, or it was in John Dunning's view, to you know, international business scholarship in which these different organizations should come together as partners, not as rivals. I was proud to work with John as the first Secretary-Treasurer of the EIBA Fellows, and that was the period when I first moved to Rutgers, and when Dunning, in a sense, as I was describing earlier, became more of a collaborator and a friend, rather than just, you know, former advisor. And as a leader, and as I say, at the earliest stage, he was really, you know, the greatest professor in the field. he had the most remarkable diplomatic skills. I saw these once or twice in the early days in Reading as department chair. But I remember in one of the earliest meetings of the fellows we had, there were a few fellows who were getting very, very upset about certain things, such as, for example, say, Hirsch, in the earliest fellows panel, it was not given the status of being a plenary session. We know one's going to organize one here tomorrow. The fellows session is now, as a consequence of this discussion, always a plenary session. But anyway, people were very kind of upset about this. And I thought we were going to have a dreadful meeting, you know, where academics are really arguing with each other, never quite agreeing. John Dunning somehow had this sort of brilliant way of just sort of calming everything down, getting people to talk to each other again, you know, creating a diplomatic atmosphere that immediately lightened the mood and succeeded in reconciling people who had appeared to be completely irreconcilable. This is something to a degree that I've never seen with anybody else. So this was, I think, something quite remarkable. And one of perhaps of the major reasons why he became so influential was that he was able to relate to so many people and bring them together in an effective way. It's an amazing organizational skill. Well, I will finish in the way that I think Vitor had suggested perhaps I should, by addressing some of the future challenges for IB research. Again, this could be a very big topic, but I'll try and do this briefly in a more sort of Dunning-esque, as I would see it, Dunning-esque way of what the future challenges would be from a Dunning-esque perspective. I think we need to restore a systemic approach in the IB field, as I've been arguing for some time, which is actually more challenging to do now than it was back in the early days of those initial Dunning contributions between the 50s and 70s, because today the real world is, the international business system is somehow more complex, more interrelated. The different kinds of relationships are more difficult to address. Plus, at the subjective or subject level, the number of disciplines that have now become interested. So, you know, back in the day, it was mainly economics, political science, a little bit of geography and history, you know, but it was really primarily, in our case, economics. And that's no longer the case. It's now genuinely multidisciplinary. It's both micro and macro in terms of methods and ideas. And so this means that bringing these things together is somewhat harder as a challenge. And therefore, I would say we need to construct more meaningful and effective interdisciplinary constructs. That's where I believe the eclectic paradigm is actually so important. And hence conversations between people who might not otherwise speak to one another. To develop, in other words, higher level theories, as Dunning often attempted to do, which draw on and speak to multiple different disciplines and methodologies. In other words, we need to avoid pigeonholing strands of research. Let's say, you know, over here we have the quantitative people, over there you have the qualitative people. We don't really speak to one another because we have different ways of thinking. Or, you know, I'm a person who works on HR and personnel and, you know, organization behavior. You're somebody who works on business strategy. So we won't talk to each other because we don't really see eye to eye. IB can't, I think, afford to dissipate into that or become dissolved into these different parts. We need to continue to be able to talk to one another as a field and have, to some degree at least, an integrated approach to the subject. And so that, I think, is a very kind of Dunning-esque view, but it's a very important one for our field today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much. Now we'll move from US, from Rutgers to Canada, to the University of Victoria, to listen to Christine Brandl, who is also associate member of John H. Dunning Center for International Business in Reading, Madrid.
It's okay, I can do it. It looks like it's frozen. Does it actually move? No. Is that okay?
I don't know why.
It doesn't work. Oh,
No,
there.
no.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vitor, for inviting me to be part of this panel. My name is Christian Brandl. I'm Associate Professor of the University of Victoria in Canada. I am invited as a EIBA country representative of Canada. And now you wonder, why is there a Canada representative at EIBA? Well, we have a lot of EIBA or a lot of Canadians participating in EIBA, and that's why I'm here to represent the Canadians as well. I'm also EIBA Internal Relations Officer, and this is a new position we created at EIBA to communicate better with our members and to create more values to our members. And if you read the newest version of EIBA Scene, which I would highly recommend you anyways to read, I think there is a clear description as well what we are supposed to do with our new positions. I was invited here to maybe bring a little bit of a different perspective to the panel, a perspective which is incorporating also maybe the younger generation of IB scholars and how we can use what already has been discussed by the research from John Dunning and John Cantwell into maybe the EIBA community and also the younger scholars at EIBA, and how can they use all of the information we've received so far for their own research. Of course, when I was asked by Vitor to be part of this panel, my first thought was this: why? What have I done? Why have I agreed to this? This is going to be scary. And standing here now with this esteemed panel here and talking about John Dunning and John Cantwell is a little bit scary, I have to admit. Nonetheless, I thought back to where I'm coming from, and that I spent 3 years at the University of Reading. I know a little bit about the Reading School and now how Reading was built up and how it came to that dominance in the international business field. And so my second thought was then, okay, let's go to battle, work this out, do a presentation with a little bit of fun and jokes, and just have fun and see where it goes, and kind of bring that maybe different perspective to the panel as well. So the biggest problem I had was, if I needed to talk about John Dunning specifically, is of course I never met John Dunning myself. And that is, if you need to talk about someone's contribution to an international business field, is of course would be great to have met the person yourself. And so I reverted back to what I know and do a little bit of research, of course. And so I conducted some secondary research, and I came across all of those citations, the books, the articles, the contribution, the academic contribution of John Dunning to the international business field. And of course I was scared. And I want to say to all of the younger scholars here in the audience, this is a CV of an extremely productive academic at a time where there was a need for theory as well in the international business field. So don't take this maybe as your guiding force, unless of course you're extremely driven. But this is a CV, this output, this academic output is extremely high. And that's why it's so humbling as well to stand here and talk about this academic contribution to the international business field, which I'm associating so strongly with as well. Of course, part of this contribution to academia wasn't necessarily only that, well, the brilliancy and the academic research in itself, but also the contribution to the community, and specifically to the EIBA community. And we've heard in the talks already today that both John Dunning and John Cantwell have exceptionally contributed to the EIBA community with their time, with their dedication to make this a community which progresses also younger scholars and supports younger scholars. And so there were EIBA tutorials which were supported by both, and I just wanted to emphasize that again, so that's from a younger perspective, from maybe a PhD student perspective, that contribution is extremely important for us. Learning from these really big scholars and learning from them firsthand and getting feedback is exceptional. Of course, the secondary research doesn't really help me much with really fully understanding who these important people are who contributed so much to the academic field. And so I did a little bit of a primary research and did some phone calls with my network to understand who John Dunning was. And I mean, I had some drinks with John CANTWELL myself, and we spent some time in the pub, but of course I couldn't do that with John Dunning. And so I called up Rajneesh Narula, who was a PhD student under John Dunning, and Helena Bernard, who was also connected in terms of PhD supervision with John Dunning. And what really struck me when I spoke to them both was the dedication to supporting young scholars, to supporting their research and supervising them, and having really a distinct also supervision approach. And what Rajneesh told me was really that that dedication to supporting their research and supporting also contribution to the academic field was really significant. And part of that was also that John Dunning was extremely driven and had also instilled that drive to his younger followers and his peers. And we can see that here as well with John CANTWELL as his former PhD student, that drive of, you know, contributing to the international business field was instilled by the supervisor. And there was a really nice quote Rajneesh told me about that John Dunning really never stopped working and contributing to the IB field. He was always driven by the competition with, and he called it my young people. So all of his like PhD students and postdocs, he considered as kind of his competition. So he wasn't really wanting to let this go, this competition and drive. And so the same with Helena as well. Helena told me a little bit about, you know, how he was supervising straight to the point, really constructive feedback, handwritten, and that is something which Vitor also told me about, that handwritten notes were extremely important. So then I moved on and talked and researched a little bit about John CANTWELL. And again, I came across this massive amount of contribution to the academic field, this really book chapters, citations, still articles running, still coming, and impressive list of contribution to, from an academic perspective, to the international business field. And also still that continuous involvement with the EIBA community, and as co-editor now with the EIBA scene, and fellow, and I don't want to repeat what was already said. So really that the dedication to a community and to making this community really home as well, which is extremely important for younger scholars, because they of course are lost at the beginning, and we need guidance and we need individuals to help us and support us. And so that is really what is driving a lot of the community here at EIBA. And I spoke to, of course, Helena and Rajneesh also about John CANTWELL, and what was really striking was specifically Helena's comment about that John is like a library, and you could ask him anything and he knows exactly what he's talking about. And the only thing is really, if he starts a sentence with "I believe," you might need to check up the sources a little bit more. But if he doesn't start a sentence with "I believe," you can be sure that this is the reading list you really need to use further for your academic progress. And so yeah, this is again, I mean, interesting to understand supervision styles. And the quote from Rajneesh is also really interesting, saying that there was, of course, this rivalry going on between students as well. And you know, Rajneesh wanted to do something what John already done, and Dunning was just telling him, don't even try, it's no point, CANTWELL has done it all. And so this is really representative again for that, for the drive of that small group of academics really guided by John Dunning. So now, of course, part of my presentation today was also to take maybe a perspective on what can we do forward as well with that historic and seminal work of John Dunning and John CANTWELL. And again, as already was outlined, as probably everyone knows as well, is what the foundational work here is. So the OLI, or the elected paradigm on one hand, and then the technology and innovation on the other hand, which is basically Cantwell's contribution and Dunning's contribution. And so over the last couple of years, we could see that a lot of research still is published in that area, and it's really using that foundational work, specifically also the OLI on one hand, that foundational work in identifying the behavior of multinational enterprises. And while we've seen a lot of changes in the ownership, so different types of firms are appearing on the market, we have different changes in locations as well. We have more and more emerging markets coming as well, and different kind of background information here. We see also that there have been changes in the evolutions into internalization theory. And maybe I want to probe here a bit and say, we've got so much modification on internalization theory, maybe it's time to move on and set this aside and maybe consider new research areas in a way, or take this forward maybe and take this as the foundation, but then move on. With regards to technology and innovation in a modern world, I think exactly what John already said. Maybe there's a little bit of a silver lining as well, because during the COVID pandemic, we've seen that the significance of that research on technological knowledge and innovation has really come back. And we really see that this relationship between multinational enterprises, governments, universities, social institutions are more and more important, specifically in these times of a pandemic, where we have to we've seen that all of these actors have worked together to try to make a vaccine, to distribute the vaccine, to really kind of communicate and make and solve kind of this global problem. And so maybe silver lining here is that we really have that foundational work already, and now we can build on that and take this forward. And as already was mentioned as well, is that institutional environment, which has both in both cases, in Dunning's and in Cantwell's cases, been foundational as well for the argument of the research which was produced. And maybe a little selfishly, I really want to emphasize this again. This is also part of my research agenda. And so this is something where we are still needing more research, where we need to go and move forward and use that foundational work. And speaking of also moving forward and trying to maybe open the next chapter of international business, there are a couple of fields which I think we haven't really taken too serious yet, and where I think we have an obligation to contribute as well, and using the foundational work by Dunning and Cantwell can help us do that as well. And I think some of these areas are, for example, the consideration of a more sustainable world, and maybe considering not just the market focus and the market activities, but also the non-market activities, which multinational firms are obliged to maybe also consider in the future. And that relates directly also to the dark side of international business, which we have neglected a little bit in the past. And again, this might be also a little selfishly referring back to my own research, but that is something which we could maybe consider more in the future, and using that foundational work again by Dunning and Cantwell, and to move it also in a discussion of maybe multinational enterprises have not always behaved in the most appropriate manner, and we need to consider that as well. We also might want to consider and reconsider the different new forms of firms which have appeared, particularly also during the pandemic. Everything related to artificial intelligence and platform firms, might we have different characteristics, and might we need reconsideration of the original very established theories which we have in international business. And all of that, of course, culminates also in that discussion which we had already today about the importance of maybe policy, and how can we make sure that our research is also accepted and acknowledged in the outside academic world. Because very often it feels like we are in this silo and we work for ourselves and we work for our community, but we not always are considering maybe the outside, and have built up that relationship with maybe the policy sphere. And I mean, I know that there are some academics, and we've heard about as well presentations at the United Nations, but I think that relationship needs to be stronger in order to make a real impact and have our research as well implemented in a more, in other environments as well. So I want to conclude with this picture and a quote which I was I heard John say on Thursday when he actually received his honorary doctorate, where he said, the more we know, the more we realize also that we don't know. And I think with that, I leave you and with that smiles of academics who have guided the international business field from its inception, from the beginning, who have been incremental for the progress of international business in the field. And it was an honor to stand here and talk about it at least a little bit. Thank you so much, Vitor, for inviting me, and thank you.
We'll move now to Oslo for a remote connection with Birgitta Grogar. Well, can support what she will make her presentation from Oslo in a remote connection. Okay.
No.
Hi, Birgitta.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank
Can
you.
you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
No, no se la oye. No, diciendo. ¿Ya ha presentado esta ponente?
Yeah. I'm trying to share my screen from here.
So I can send you now.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I think
Good.
you can see it now,
Ahora
right?
lo que pasa es que no se la oye. We don't hear, yes.
No, we can't.
You hear me? Okay, so
No,
I'm assuming.
One second. We don't hear.
Okay.
Ah, está Antonio, vale.
Well, I apologize, but there are some difficulties with sound.
Aquí sí está.
Sí, ya. Ah, es esto.
No, pero está.
Por eso intento su micrófono. Así va a estar bien silenciado.
Ah,
Maybe you are.
no.
Ella no lo sabemos.
Participar. No. Lo veo aquí. Está activo.
Sí, lo tiene activo.
To everybody, I hope that in a
¿Por qué no la vemos aquí?
seconds we can listen to presentation by Birgitta from Oslo. Unfortunately,
Está
she
bien.
could not travel
Sí, sí.
to Madrid. That's why we forged
Aquí
this,
está bien.
this solution,
Está
this
bien.
second best solution.
Ahí está.
And Birgitta will talk about the general topic and put it into the perspective of the future of EIBA, namely the future of EIBA conferences and the next EIBA conference in Oslo in 2022.
We can listen to.
So are you able to hear me now?
No. No.
Well, one problems are being solved. I think we may pass the floor to raise any questions. So please, who has any question to raise to the members of the panel, is the right time to do so while the technical problems are being solved. No questions?
No, I don't know what.
I don't know.
Si salimos seguramente o no.
Everybody has been so clear.
que vuelva a
Nobody has
entrar.
questions about all these histories.
Can you turn off and open.
of
You can
Honoris
listen.
Causa Doctorates.
Sí,
No,
habla.
no,
Sí, sí, habla por ahí.
Good.
Tiene que oír aquí.
You can listen us.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sí.
Can you turn off and come back to the presentation? Because maybe do you have a problem with your sound, your microphone?
So are you not hearing me? I hear you fine.
Yes, we can listen.
Okay, but you can, so you can hear me but not see the screen?
Probably with the micro.
We can listen you. I don't know why.
The problem with sound.
No sé por qué.
It's a problem with sound.
Where is her microphone?
No,
But,
no estaban dando audio.
Sí. I found very interesting
Your computer.
the remarks by Christian
The computer
regarding
don't send you us the audio.
Sorry.
regarding the handwriting by John Dunning. Usually he used to write with a pencil, always sharpened. And the first time I met him, it was in 1981 in Lisbon, not in academic context. And I was really surprised by the time he got in a sharpened pencil, to have his pencil always sharp. And it is interesting that now that Elena Barnard has mentioned, would have written with a pencil for sure. For sure. John? I think. Okay.
So I have. I have something, it's a funny story to tell in that respect.
Mira, yo creo que
John
se ha
Dunning
seguido.
was very much kind of the old school.
¿Y este?
I was actually the
Y pero
first
este cómo lo saca.
generation to type my dissertation on
El micro, José Víctor.
The macro doesn't work. So
Now,
that one works.
yes, this works.
Okay.
no.
This works?
A ver si ahora.
So this is working now. Yeah, this is working now. So I was one of the first generation to actually start typing on a computer, you know, and to do my dissertation actually on one of the very first Apple Macintoshes, which must be worth a small fortune now. John Dunning, however, was of the old school, as were all the professors in Reading at the time, which is to say they wrote their papers by hand. And John, in fact, continued with this practice all the way through to the end. So he used to give a secretary his handwritten manuscripts. He would often write papers on a plane and come back to Reading with, you know, an entire sort of manuscript that was then given to the secretary to type. But when we speak about recognize, you know, his handwriting was not necessarily the easiest to understand. And of course, because I came to know him so well, and because also our thinking, as I said earlier, was on the same page, and therefore I would often understand what he was trying to say. When, for example, we were co-authoring papers, it was very easy for him to give me his handwritten text and for me to incorporate that. But I would find that very often the secretaries in Reading would visit my office pleading for my help because he would have turned in a paper and there were many words they couldn't understand. So I had to help kind of interpret what this actually meant.
Rajneesh told me exactly the same thing as well, that he had sometimes to translate the scribbles as well.
Yeah.
May I say a little story? about one of the Johns. In 92, I organized a national conference in Jerez de la Frontera, Cádiz. And in the program was an international panel. And I invited some of the EIBA board members. We had a meeting in Jerez de la Frontera. At the time was the exposition in Seville and also a fair in Jerez de la Frontera. And the mayor of the city gave us a reception with flamenco. Jerez is an important city for flamenco. And I discovered at that time that some of our colleagues from EIBA, especially John Cantwell, felt the music very deeply. Because after we were showing flamenco singers and players, we saw John Cantwell clapping and moving, following the rhythm of the music. So that's something that he has to develop. Was very interesting feature of John Cantwell.
Yeah, I think there's another commonality. I think both John Dunning and I appreciated music. Is Brigitte online? I don't think so.
I think there might be no point in asking her to.
You can't hear me, or can you hear me now?
Yes,
I don't think we can. I don't think we can resolve them
I
by time.
think they will not be. They will not be
No has
solved.
conseguido nada, ¿no?
So
Y además es que no me
I
deja, no me deja,
move
no me deja
my
escribirla.
invitation
No,
for
mira,
for questions.
Come on, guys, questions means you asking, we answering.
No puedo escribirla, me dice que Bridget no está en la reunión.
Or I can say a bit more.
And you
Vamos pasando
can't
con el Zoom.
hear me yet?
Arriba está habilitado.
Just to, I think you should have an opportunity to respond a bit to Kristen.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
A ver,
So I could say a few words in reaction to what Kristen very nicely said.
Can you hear me now?
First thing is, of course, Helena Bernard, as you mentioned, was a student of mine. But the point is, which is coming across from your recollection of her, is that John Dunning, although he had retired a few years earlier, really wanted to be involved. Involved not just in coming to give a talk, but he wanted to be involved in interacting with the students. And I think Helena's experience is very much summarizing that, you know, he wasn't just, you know, I'm the big guy coming from outside and, you know, she was giving detailed comments on a manuscript. You know, he was obviously on a committee and therefore, you know, she had that relationship with him, but it was clearly that he was, you know, committed to doing these things. He did visit Rutgers in those days annually. I mentioned earlier he was in my office, and he was on a number of different student committees. So retirement for John Dunning was not really retirement. He would, you know, actually he was writing on his hospital bed all the way through to the time he actually died. I think perhaps Christine wanted to get him to stop at some point, you know, but he never did. He would always have the note paper and pen and so on and pencil on his lap. When you say that I was like a library, or Helena did, that reflects what I was saying earlier on, you know, that in my view, what we should do is to go back and read around the subject area, not just in a very focused way. You know, I'm working on a paper on this, therefore I have to read these things. But if you read around, then you get a kind of overview and a way of framing the subject that enables you to, you know, draw on that general kind of perspective. So I think that, you know, reading deeply is a greatly desirable feature, particularly of a field like ours that's multidisciplinary, as I said earlier. I agree with you, by the way, on internalization theory, but then John Dunning and I, that was part of the debate that I referred to earlier, that, you know, Peter Buckley and Mark Casson saw this and Hennart sees exclusive theory of the multinational firm. We always saw it as part of a much bigger picture and shouldn't be given an exclusive focus in the way, for example, that Rajneesh Narula now gives it in his work, unfortunately. Clearly, he didn't learn as much from John Dunning as perhaps we might have liked. Lastly, on your points about sustainability, And you know, the wider context. I think this is really important. And of course, yesterday's panel in the opening plenary, I think, helped us to address that these interchanges with policymakers, the influence, as I said in the Honoris Causa ceremony, the influence that international business has on the environment, including the natural environment as well as the social environment, is absolutely critical for us to understand now as part of a co-evolutionary process between the two. And of course, this gets down to a very practical level, even if we're talking about management policy, senior management policy in a large company, or we're talking about public policy. People have to be aware of this interrelationship, I think, increasingly, in order to be able to understand how to, you know, adapt to this reality that we have today, and you know, things like climate change, you know, biodiversity and so on, that we're going to have to accommodate in a way that we haven't really until now.
Okay, let me thank Birgitta very much for the effort. Unfortunately, due to technical conditions, it was not possible to listen to Birgitta's presentation. I thank her very, very much. And I am sure that Oslo 2022 will be a wonderful, memorable conference. I do not know whether anybody else from the panel has any further words. There is one point in Christine's presentation that I fully corroborate, which is the encyclopedic knowledge of John Cantwell. He has ideas and very important insights on every issue, even in cricket. Okay? Thanks. So, Christine?
Okay.
And one.
I think I just want to say thank you, Vitor, for inviting me, and thank you so much for organizing a panel like this. I had a great time when I actually attended the honorary doctorate ceremony, and I have to say I'm very inspired by John Dunning's and John Cantwell's work as well. I mean, this is international business. This is my community, and I'm proud to have been part of this panel, and yeah, to spend some time with John as well was amazing. And thank you so much, Vitor.
Okay, thank you. I thank very much the members of the panel and the audience. I think it was a very nice session about the history of EIBA. And please enjoy the conference and see you in a next session. Thank you very much. All the best. Thanks, Birgitta.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Sorry.
See you next year.
See you next year, hopefully.
Well, for you is see you, yes, next year in May or so.
Yes.
Board meeting.